This universe is vast and complicated in ways very few of us will ever have the liberty to fully understand. None of us know the secrets and inner workings of this reality in which we live, and yet it is all we have ever experienced. Today we're going to explore the story of one Avery Myers, a 24-year-old woman who, for a moment, was able to peek behind the curtain, to lift the veil of infinity and bear witness to what lay underneath. Upon following her story, we will find ourselves across the mirror's edge. Hi, my name is Avery. I'm currently 24, but at the time this happened, I was 18, still living at my mom's house just outside Sacramento. I've considered writing this all out for a while now. I figured maybe it would all make sense when I reread the whole thing to myself. But I've given up on making sense of this whole thing some time ago. It takes time, but I eventually got to a place of acceptance. It was either that or insanity. This happened back in the summer of '97, so coming up on 6 years ago now. At the time, I had this black 1987 Honda Rebel 250 motorcycle. I couldn't find a car I both liked and could afford, so I ended up buying the bike off my neighbor when he wanted something faster. It was literally my daily driver. Nothing crazy, flashy, or expensive, but it was on the smaller side, so it was perfect for a girl like me. Once school let out for the summer, I had gotten into the habit of riding the bike from my house and taking the scenic route down this curvy road pretty much all the way into Sacramento. It was beautiful. There were so many hills, forests, and 2 different bridges to cross over on the way. I'd ride in for the day, maybe meet with some old friends, and head back. I was still figuring out my next move after high school, so I had way too much time on my hands and made that trip a few times a week. Now, when I say this road is curvy, what I really mean is that most people I know refuse to drive most parts of it. At some points, it literally feels like a roller coaster, and it's so thin that it really seems like it should be a one-way, especially during those turns. Needless to say, late one afternoon around sunset, I must have been approaching the city on one of those bends when I guess I turned too hard into a blind curve before sliding straight underneath a white Sprinter van. I don't remember much of that though, just a few mental stills. I remember the van. I remember the silver grille quickly approaching my face, and the sensation of falling to my left as the road slipped out from under me. The very next thing I do remember is what permanently fucked me up. I have this extremely vivid memory of myself underneath the van. I'm not sure if I had been awake the entire time, or if I had been knocked out right away. I still had my helmet on, but the visor had been shattered and the whole thing was spun around my head quite a bit. Somewhere behind me, there were first responders and medical workers just arriving to the scene, so I imagine I must have been under there for at least 15 or 20 minutes by that point. The first thing I noticed was the smell of gasoline. I don't distinctly remember feeling much pain, but after looking around, I saw that my bike had been completely obliterated. Most of it seemed to be scattered across the road next to me underneath the van. I distinctly saw one of my white brake levers laying inches from my face. My left arm was laying to my left as well, soaked in what must have been gas from the bike. I had just topped it off, too. I slowly reached for the broken off brake lever before clinging to it as if it was the last thing holding me to this earth. It was difficult to see the rest of my body because of the way I was positioned and the way my helmet was turned around my head, but after a moment, I realized that just above my waist, I was being crushed by one of the rear tires. Now, this takes a lot of strange, morbid turns, but just stick with me. When I looked down at the lower half of my body, the first thought I had was of beef chili. I don't know how to accurately explain this moment to people, but there was literally a fucking tire where my midsection was supposed to be. There was a long red skid mark on the road to my right that led to what was left of me. Yeah. Immediately, I came to the realization that I was never going to make it out from underneath that van. Forget walking or kicking a soccer ball. I was never going to have children. I was never going to see my 19th birthday. I was never going to see my family, or my house, or my friends, ever again. It was so clear and obvious to me. I guess your brain just numbs you after that point, floods you with whatever chemicals, and decides to make the process as easy as possible, because, again, I don't remember feeling any pain at all, other than the knowledge that I was 0 stupid decisions away from being a literal stain on the ground. I must have gone under after that, because that's where my memory goes blank. Until I opened my eyes again. Barely, though. There was a brief moment where I came to, obviously in the hospital. The smell of disinfectant and the sounds of machines beeping and whirring make that part of my memory extremely clear. There were people moving around me. Looking down at the rest of my body, all I could see was red. Doctors were fiddling around with my insides, as gross and terrifying as it is to say. But that's about all that stuck with me from that little blip of consciousness. After that, it was lights out again. This next part is super weird, but given how strange the rest of this story is, I figure I shouldn't discredit any part of the experience. After that, I had this kind of dream where I had a strong sensation of falling. Almost like those dreams where you jolt yourself awake after feeling like you're going to tip over, except my body never woke me up. I just kept falling for what felt like forever. Suddenly, it seemed that somewhere around my neck area abruptly hit a snag while I was plummeting downwards, like a hook had snagged the collar of my shirt while falling at terminal velocity, violently catching me from my descent into the void. The second this occurred in the dream, I discovered that I was laying on my back, staring up at the white drop ceiling of my hospital room. I don't remember waking up or really any transition from the dream at all. I just found myself laying there with a pounding headache. It feels so surreal looking back. The room was barely illuminated in a blue hue from the moonlight leaking in from the open window. I felt like I was going to be sick. It reminded me of spinning around in the chair in my parents' office as a kid, kicking the floor with my feet over and over, spinning faster and faster before curling up into a ball and doubling my speed. It took me a minute to lock onto the hands of the wall clock in front of me. It was just past 11 p.m. Eventually, barely lifting my head up, I caught sight of my mom sleeping on a small love seat in front of the window, sound asleep with a thin blue blanket the hospital must have provided for her. For a moment, I considered the possibility that I had died. Putting everything together, I had been riding down that curvy stretch. Then I was underneath the back tire of that fucking van. I had accepted my own death so easily in that moment, not because I was ready to go by any means, but because survival seemed so far out of the realm of possibility after looking down that I had no choice but to prepare myself. Looking down at my body, laying flat on the bed, I was astonished to find what seemed to be both of my intact legs underneath the sheets. I tried to move my toes, assuming they were still there, but couldn't. Whatever was left of me had to have been paralyzed. I tried to move my arms, which lay straight against my torso. They weren't in casts and didn't seem to be broken. My right shoulder was tight and sore, but that was the extent of the damage to my upper body from what I could tell. I slowly peeled back the sheets, expecting the worst, only to find that my legs weren't even wrapped at all. A little bruised and scratched, but again, nothing significant. It was astonishing. Impossible. I sat up and hung my legs off the side of the bed, confirming that no, I wasn't paralyzed. My feet were just asleep. Pins and needles. In disbelief, I began massaging my legs as the feeling slowly returned to them when I heard my mom roll over on the other side of the room. We both immediately burst into tears after seeing each other. I tried to stand up, but after wincing at the feeling of my heartbeat banging in my skull, she rushed over to lay me back down. After we cried in each other's arms for a bit, both of us unable to get any words out, I asked her what happened, specifically. I told her that I knew I had been hit, but couldn't put together much else. "You were flying down that road Amy caught you speeding down last month," she said, her disappointment bleeding through her half-hearted attempt at a laugh. Amy was her friend from work. She allegedly saw me blow through a stop sign on a main road a few weeks prior near the city, but I'm pretty sure the spot she must have seen me at was just a back road. "I always said that bike was gonna get you into trouble one day. Haven't I said that since the day you got that thing?" "Yeah, well, I guess you're not gonna have to worry about that anymore," I said, breaking my gaze. "Good, it's about time you sell that thing. Get something safe and reliable. That Camry down the street is still for sale. We could probably scoop it up if it rides good." "Sell it?" "Mom, that fucker is totaled. It basically liquefied upon impact." I tried to roll over towards her, but a sharp pain in my shoulder made me wince. I went back down flat on my back. "Watch your language," she snapped with some restraint. "No, unfortunately, it's just got a little gash on the side, but it's still in one piece. Your Uncle John picked it up and rode it back to the house earlier. After this scare, though, I do want you to sell it anyways." Other than my still being in one piece, it was around this point that the discrepancies began to stand out. "He rode it home?" "What do you mean he rode it home?" "Yeah, but don't worry, he didn't mind." "No. Mom." "What? The bike is gone. I saw the whole thing spread out underneath the van." The memory of seeing myself spread underneath the van suddenly came back to me, and with it came the pressure in my head. It felt like my brain was being pumped full of air. "Can we get the fuck out of here? I need some air." "Language," she barked. "You're not going anywhere. I'll crack a window." She opened it maybe an inch or two. "But, honey, there was no van." I shot a wild look at her. "What do you mean there was no van?" "It wasn't a van. It was an elderly lady in a little yellow Beetle." I locked eyes with her for a second before releasing with a laugh. No. There was definitely a van. She shook her head dismissively. "There was a van. I was under the van, I glanced down at my perfectly intact torso. "I probably shouldn't have riled you up, honey. We'll figure out all the details in the morning." She wrapped her arms around me. "I'm just glad you're okay." I wasn't so sure that I was. I later discovered that we were downtown and that the worst of my injuries turned out to be a minor concussion and some abrasions to my arms and legs. Other than that, my protective gear had seemingly done its job. Still, the puzzle pieces didn't fit together in my mind. There is absolutely no way that Uncle John could have rode that bike home. I saw it myself, mangled in pieces next to me. The bike was unrideable, unfixable, a total loss for sure, and I didn't have collision on that thing either, which was a total bummer. Even more disturbingly, though, was the memory of myself. I knew I had been underneath a van, and I'm convinced to this day that my mind just couldn't have created that image out of thin air. The image of that tire crushing my body, flattened from the waist down, to see parts of myself that I have been carrying around for my whole life and have never seen, was never supposed to see. I don't know. I can't get it out of my mind, even all these years later. It's something I'll have to lug around with me for the rest of my life. The next day, I had some imaging tests done at the hospital to ensure that there was no internal bleeding in my skull, and when it was confirmed that I didn't, I was sent back home to rest. We left the city sometime later that day. The shitty roads we had to take on the way home really started fucking with my head. Every little bump felt like I was getting whacked in the head with a shovel, and for the cherry on top, I was making myself even more sick trying to rationalize everything I had seen. I decided to put it all in a big box in my head and figure it out later when I wasn't recovering from a concussion. But that only lasted for a few miles until we pulled into the driveway. Red. The front door was red. "What the hell?" I said, pointing through the windshield. Mom looked around. "What?" She clearly couldn't see the issue. She glared at me. "Please, you're starting to freak me out." "This whole thing is freaking me out," I shouted, pointing again to the front of the house. "The door, Mom." She spun her head to inspect the issue. "What about the door?" "It's red." "It's always been red. Do I have to show you pictures to prove that it's always been red?" "Yes, that door was black. Why would it be red? The house is blue. It looks stupid." I threw off my seatbelt, jumped out of the car, and slammed the door shut before stomping over to the door. I stared at it until my mom came up behind me, standing there waiting for me to say something. I turned to search her face, but saw no dishonesty, only a concern that I had never seen on her face at any point in the past. I was beginning to scare her. It shook me up enough to make me drop the whole thing and step inside. I refused to lie to her and pretend that everything was okay within myself, but after the accident, perhaps my own mind, my own memories had become untrustworthy. A terrifying realization, but one that felt like a step in the right direction at the time. Admitting that I was unwell seemed to offer some distance between the discrepancies I was seeing around me. I dragged myself up the stairs and into my room, mind still in a fog, and collapsed onto my bed. For the next few hours, it felt like I was keeping myself just below the surface of consciousness, almost as if my brain was keeping part of itself awake to try and piece together the inconsistencies in my memory. It didn't feel like my mind really got any rest. I ended up basically reviewing the last 24 hours all over again. I feared that I would never actually come to grips with how I went from being under that van with no hope of ever seeing the world again to here, walking around in one piece with not so much as a broken bone. It terrified me. Not just the impossibility of it all, but the idea that maybe part of me really did die under there. The part of me that could close the loops of understanding. I fear that now there would always be part of me still underneath that tire, trying to understand how the universe seemed to bend the facts just enough to keep me alive. I dreamed of myself back on my bike, flying down an infinitely long road at full speed. I felt that this was my reality now, constantly spinning at 10,000 RPM, trying to solve the riddle, trying to determine what happened, why I was still here, when I knew it to be impossible. I wished I could just squeeze my hand over the brakes and bring the whole ride to a stop. The brake lever. The brake lever! Holy shit! I flew up in my bed, drenched in sweat with that funky taste in my mouth, still wearing my shoes from when I had gotten home several hours earlier. A goldenrod hue dripped into my room from the window. The brake lever. One of the white brake levers was undeniably laying next to me under the van, broken off from the rest of the bike during the crash. I knew that for a fucking fact. I even touched it, grabbed it. I remember the feeling of the scraped paint as my fingers made contact with it. There was no way I could have made that up. What, as some sort of false concussion dream? No way. I refused to believe it. I sprung out of bed almost fast enough to make me pass out again. Right, because that's exactly what I needed. Another head injury. I slowly made my way down the stairs, gripping the railing before passing through the living room, trying to make it to the garage. As I entered the kitchen, I made eye contact with my mom, who had been staring down at her folded hands. "Did you get some rest?" she asked. There was no food, no magazine, no TV remote. She was just sitting there like she didn't know what to do with herself. "No, not really," I said, sneaking past her. Do we have any ibuprofen?" "The doctors want you taking Tylenol instead. Something about brain bleeding." "Ah, wouldn't want that," I said, pulling open the screen door to the garage. As the door closed behind me, I flicked on the lights. After staring at it for about 5 seconds, I swung my bare foot into the tub of recyclable cans as hard as I could. The bin hit the wall, its contents flying out, echoing explosively inside the small space. Fuck. What the fuck? The bike was practically in perfect shape. I mean, I could tell that it had taken a fall, but everything was intact. The headlight had cracked a bit, the seat had a nice little tear, and as Mom had pointed out earlier, a bit of a gash on the gas tank. In actuality, it was more of a scuff. Nothing even seemed to be leaking out. I unscrewed the gas cap, and I could still see the surface of the fuel twinkling in the light from the gas towards the surface. Nothing had even leaked out. Mom practically kicked down the door. "What happened? Are you all right?" I just stared at the levers, both of them perfectly clean, bright, glossy white. "Yeah, I just tripped over the bin," I said, standing up off the bike and picking up the cans. "Gonna take some time to get my balance back, I guess." She just stared right through me with her arms crossed. "Is something going on? Something other than the accident?" I didn't want to scare her, but I didn't know how long I could keep all this to myself. "No, I'm fine, Mom. Just shaken up. Happy to still be here." We had dinner after that and watched a movie. Mom had to return to Blockbuster tomorrow, but I wasn't really present for any of it. I was still a few layers deep, wheels turning, trying to close that loop. Sifting through the box of puzzle pieces. I wondered if God had mixed a few boxes together, trying to screw with me. I guess not much else really happened that night. Went to bed after that, and from what I remember, slept a good 10 or so hours. The next day, I decided to try and keep my mind off things. From what the doctors said, it could take up to a month before I was back to 100%, and even then, there could be some lingering symptoms. As confusing and fucked up as my thoughts were, I knew that I would have a better chance of coming to terms with everything once my brain was healed and I could see things from a healthy perspective. I tried my best to ignore the growing list of inconsistencies around the house and tried to divert my attention. I made my bed, cleaned my room, listened to the radio. I tried reading, but the fogginess didn't allow me to get more than a few pages farther into The Giver. I was interrupted from what must have been my third reread of that page when Mom called from downstairs that Lisa was here and wanted to see me. Okay, this is going to take some more backstory. When I was really little, like probably 5 years old, I met one of my best friends when I was in kindergarten. Lisa and I were pretty much two ingredients for the perfect storm. I always seemed to have terrible ideas for pranks and other stupid things, and she always seemed to have the balls to actually act them out. One time, she had a doctor's appointment, and her mom gave her a note to get out of class. I asked her to give it to me, and I made a bunch of photocopies in the library with the date covered up, so she basically could leave whenever she wanted. So one day, she handed the teacher a copy. It worked, and instead of running home or whatever, she walked out, ran right back around to the classroom window, and started popping her head up whenever the teacher turned towards the blackboard, making all the other kids laugh from her stupid faces. She did that maybe 2 or 3 times before she threw a crumpled up ball of paper through the window, and it hit the teacher on the back of the head. And well, that was the end of that. She was extremely smart for her age, too, despite seeming like such a clown on the surface. She had this view on life that I still feel I cannot effectively capture within myself, even all these years later. Perhaps it requires the innocence of childhood to synthesize, and my opportunity to adopt it has long since passed. I guess I didn't really see it, though, until one hot afternoon in the summer before the 9th grade. We rode our bikes up to Folsom Lake before dumping them at a small beach and watching the sunset. Sitting there, I asked her how she really felt about her parents' divorce. They had split up a few months prior, and ever since, we started hanging out even more than we usually did. I tried not to bring it up for a long time because I figured she would when she felt she was ready, but I guess it had been so long that I had grown impatient. After a bit of a pause, she gave me an unexpected response. "You know," she began, picking up a stone from the beach, "it bothered me for a few months. The first few weeks were the worst." She stood up and threw the rock out towards the lake, but it hit the ground a few feet short from the waterline. I used to wander around my house a lot in that hour before my mom gets home, and it was just me, alone, and I'd think about how everything around me was going to start changing pretty soon. She sat back down, not meeting my gaze. I could feel my life approaching the end of a volume, you know? That kind of change is scary. I never had anything like that before, and it's like, I realized the change was coming just before it happened. Those moments when I was alone felt like the calm before the storm. It felt like my house was a museum almost, of when everything was normal. I'd just walk around and think about all the memories I had in every little corner. So, it's tough? I remember thinking how stupid it was to say that. Of course it was tough. Yeah, no doubt, but you know what else? She asked. What? It's kind of necessary. Not divorce, but I don't know. Pain, I guess. Confusion. I used to ask my parents all kinds of questions, like, why? And is there anything I can do to fix it? Is there anything I can do to keep things comfortable? To go back to the way we were? And you know what I found out? I found out there wasn't. And that hurt at first, but to let go of the burden of responsibility was a weight off my shoulders. There was nothing to figure out. There was nothing to solve, nothing to fix. All there was the path ahead. You definitely stole that out of a book, I snickered, knowing full well she didn't. Maybe I did, and I didn't even realize it, I don't know. But it's true, and I believe it, so either way, I'm taking ownership. From there, though, I was left with what was in front of me, hanging out with you, making memories. I don't know, suddenly there was room for other stuff. She paused for a second, and we listened to the waves crash onto the shore for a while. I want to start singing. Really singing. Really? I asked. Singing for who? For people, of course. Singing kind of feels like magic to me. I mean, think about it. A bunch of air comes out of your mouth, and that air bumps into more air, which bumps into more air, until it hits your ears. And somehow, from all that air and all that bumping, you feel all these vivid, intense emotions. It's enough to make you cry or understand a story or want to get up and... She popped up onto her feet. And fling your hair around? She started swinging her head around in a circle, her long brown hair following behind. She understood things about life most of us would be lucky to realize in our entire lifetimes. Sometimes I fear that I've forgotten so much of what she had to say. I should have written them down in a journal or something. After that, we both picked up our bikes, and just before we started heading home, caught sight of the single most beautiful bird I had ever seen. Holy crap, look at that bird. It's so pretty, I called, pointing to the tree above our heads. It was a western tanager, this bright red and yellow bird. It looked like a little red ember sitting high up on a branch. We stared at it for a moment, taking it in before it started to sing. Wow, little birdie. One day I hope I can sing like you, Lisa said. She never would grow up to sing. 2 weeks later, the night after our first day of 9th grade, Lisa died in her sleep. Hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, the thickening of the heart muscle, often has no warning signs, no symptoms, and once it progresses far enough, it can cause sudden cardiac arrest. 9th grade was, without a shred of a doubt, the worst year of my life. I cried so many tears, went back to all of our old spots, remembered all of our old memories on the playground, around the neighborhood, at my house, all the silly things we did together. It was my turn to have the physical places in my life start to feel like a museum. Lisa was a sister to me. We did everything together. I'd known her practically my entire life. Ever since she died, my mom and I started saying that she was visiting whenever we saw another one of those western tanagers. I used to imagine that it was her singing her heart out for me. So, when Mom called me from the kitchen because Lisa was here, I ran downstairs to look out the sliding glass door in the kitchen and see where it was. I was slightly taken aback to see a car in the driveway. Peeling my eyes from the window, I looked to my left. Standing in the entrance to the kitchen was a girl. A woman. A little taller than me, maybe a little thinner too. I'm sure you can imagine my shock. There was very little I could say or do in that moment. The tears, the confusion, I've never felt such a cocktail of emotions. It's traumatizing to have your perception of the world, the universe, turn on a dime. I used to have her prayer card on my windowsill. I hadn't even noticed that it too had become an inconsistency, just like all the other things. It had become a Queen of Hearts, of all things. Maybe in some other lifetime, that held some significance to me. Like Lisa, I too, for many months, tried to figure it out. I became disturbed, extremely anxious, jumpy, terrified. For some weeks, I couldn't even look at her. It was too much to process. Much of that trauma is sure to stay with me for the rest of my life. This is something I'm going to have to live with. But that's exactly it. That's exactly what it took for me to understand what she meant all those years ago. We spend so much of our time, so much of our brain power trying to close the loops in our minds, trying to make sense of it all, to find the last piece of that puzzle, and we imagine that when we do, all will be right with the world. But it won't be. It never will be. Not because the world is bad, but because some things are unknowable, unsolvable. The key to healing is finding peace in knowing that there are greater forces at work beyond our understanding. I can't tell you what those forces are or how they work in our favor, but they do. Don't stress too much over how little we know about the workings of our universe. I've spent the last few years of my life doing just that, and it's nearly killed me. Instead, appreciate the fact that you are lucky enough to bear witness to its magic. For me, at least, that was the missing piece. So, I'm sure many of you are wondering, what actually happened to Avery? Was this all simply a result of her concussion? And did she make up the van and the grim scene following the accident? I must admit, she did come pretty close to solving the riddle. Maybe in another lifetime she'll figure it out.